You are listening to the free version of last month's Patreon Party People podcast. To get the newest, most current podcasts as soon as they go live, simply visit patreon.com/blazehedgehog and pledge $1 or more. Patreon donors also get custom RSS feeds to download the podcast straight into their favorite listening device. And Patreon isn't just for podcasts. There's a plethora of bonus content, including artwork, downloadable games, and secret videos that are only available to donors. Donating is also the best way to show your support for everything I do. If you've ever enjoyed my blog, thought my videos were cool, liked my games, or whatever else, consider donating something. Just go to patreon.com/blazehedgehog to learn more about the multiple different ways you can show your support. Once again, that is patreon.com/blazehedgehog. Hello and welcome to the Patreon Party People podcast for May the 27th, 2019. I almost said 2018. It has been a month, folks. I know directly in the last podcast I said I'd stop apologizing for these podcasts being so late, but that's generally because I would stop apologizing for the usual reasons that the podcast is so late. We're talking like the usual stuff. I mentioned, I do babysitting for my nephews. We always go grocery shopping at the beginning of the month. Just general things like that, things that are kind of chores, but also kind of not chores, I do like seeing my nephews, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, point is, I was all ready to do the podcast on May the 13th, let's say. Mother's Day was May the 12th, and I actually wrote a considerable amount of my podcast notes. I figured, the very next day I would sit down and record the podcast, maybe the 13th, maybe the 14th, whatever it came down to. And I'd been having kind of a weird sleep schedule, so I took a nap pretty early on Mother's Day. I got woke up later that evening to kind of go out. We had cousins come over and see my mom. First time they'd ever been to the new apartment since we moved in almost 2 years ago. Year and a half. Then they left. So, I was woke up, to come out and see them, socialize, be with the family, etc. Went back to sleep because we were actually expecting my brother to show up on Mother's Day. So I laid back down, went back to sleep, probably slept for another hour or two until he showed up. And then we went and we hung out because our apartment is big enough. I might have mentioned this on past podcasts before. Sometimes for exercise, I like to walk around the entire apartment complex, just around the perimeter or whatever. And that'll take me a good 25 to 30 minutes to do, which leads me to believe that, this apartment complex is probably close to a mile wide, 1 square mile. I mean, I don't actually know the math behind that. I don't know what a square mile actually is. But the fact that it takes me that long to walk around it leads me to believe that at least the radius is probably close to a mile. It is a big apartment complex. We have multiple swimming pools, and we have multiple playground areas for kids to hang out. So he wanted to bring the nephews over, my niece over, and we go out to one of the playgrounds here in the apartment complex. And I felt absolutely fine doing this. I was a little sleepy, obviously, because I'd been up for a while at that point. That's why I was taking naps, was because, to get through Mother's Day with the way my sleep schedule was at that point, I would have been awake for 26 hours straight or something weird like that. So, I was a little tired. It wasn't a big deal. We went out to the playground, played around. I had some Hot Wheels that are normally here up on my desk with all my other junk. I'm one of those guys that apparently turned into the sort of guy that just has all this junk on his desk, all these figures that I've accumulated over the years, some of which are probably, 25 years old at this point. They're kind of mementos. But I brought some, old Hot Wheels out there. I have a Rocket League Hot Wheels that I got just, a few months ago for 97 cents. Hot Wheels barely cost anything these days. But we took those out there, the nephews, 2-year-old nephews, they played on the playground. They played with the cars I brought out. It was a good time, fun for the whole family. Was out there probably a good couple hours, maybe 3. And then we came back and I went back to sleep, and I slept probably like a full night's sleep. And I felt fine when I laid back down. And then on the 13th, I woke up just feeling absolutely miserable. I don't know what happened between me going to bed on the 12th and me waking up on the 13th, but it was bad. It felt kind of like I had food poisoning, but I can't really track down where that would have come from. Normally you associate food poisoning with like rotten meat, I guess. And the only thing I had eaten that would have like turned on me that quickly, in the 6 to 8 hours I was asleep that night. Before I laid down, we had my mom likes to shop at the clearance rack at Walmart, where they put out like the day old pastries and things like that. Usually it's things that aren't like spoiled, but she bought like these apple fritters or whatever. I don't know what you'd call them. It's not a fritter, it's something else, but I ate one of those before I laid down and went to sleep. And that's the only thing that I could figure would have maybe given me food poisoning. But I'm not entirely sure. I've had food poisoning before in my life. There was a point, I don't know, probably like 6 or 7 years ago at this point. A coworker had given my mom a Chili's gift card, and we had a Chili's there in our town in Colorado, and we'd never been to it. We'd never been to Chili's like anywhere ever at all before. So we used this like $25, $30 gift card, and we got dinner one night. And that was probably the worst dinner from like a fast food restaurant. Chili's isn't really a fast food restaurant. It's kind of dine in, but you can take out. But it's the worst kind of that food I think either of us had ever had. I got like some kind of like chicken strips, I think, and they were just kind of haphazardly thrown in a box with cheese fries, so it turned into like this big weird mess. And from that Chili's dinner, I ended up getting my first bout of food poisoning ever. And if you've never had food poisoning, it's kind of like having a knife jab into your stomach, and it gets worse anytime you eat. And it lasts for like a week. Over the course of the week, it does slowly hurt less when you eat, but it's still, something in your tummy has been damaged by the poison, or the rotten food, as the case were. And that's kind of what it felt like this time. I woke up and I had these like really bad stomach pains. I had the chills, like I had a fever, which I think, that's the other thing. Like that was long enough ago. I know some of the symptoms of what it felt like to have food poisoning, but some of this also just felt like stomach flu. Because like I said, I had the chills, like I had a fever. And those first 2 days, I probably had like 6 or 7 naps. I probably slept a good 18 to 20 hours in those first 2 to 3 days. It was a real rough experience for me. And, even as it started to stabilize, it still took like a whole week to work out of my system before I finally felt back into 100%. So that threw off like my whole plans for the podcast. But even then, a week after that, a week after Mother's Day, we're talking, some like, what was it? That would have been like up to almost May 17th, May 20th. No, that would have been, I think I ended up getting well probably by about the 16th, let's say. And the problem there is something we're going to touch on in a little more detail later on in the podcast. I actually got, like, during this whole ordeal, my very first, like, early review copy of a game. Obviously, I could have had an early review copy of Sonic Mania, and I technically did kind of get one when Sonic Mania Plus came out, but I ended up opting for a physical version of Sonic Mania Plus, which meant that when it shipped out of Sega's offices or whatever, it did not end up arriving on my doorstep until the day before the game was, going to go on sale. So this time I learned my lesson. And when Sega, offered me a review code for Team Sonic Racing, they offered it to me probably around the 12th. It was a few days before the 12th. It was probably like the 8th or the 9th of May. And obviously that game came out like May 20th or whatever, 22nd. So that was like way far in advance. And when they offered it to me, they said they had download codes for the PlayStation 4. So obviously, I jumped at that. I have a PlayStation 4. I will definitely get a review copy of Team Sonic Racing 2 weeks early. You don't have to convince me of anything in that regard. So I get over this food poisoning or whatever it is, and the embargo for the Team Sonic Racing review, it lifted on May 17th. So, I'm feeling better around May 15th, May 16th. The entire time I was sick, I did play, quite a bit of Team Sonic Racing, but I wasn't really in the kind of good feeling mood to start my review or anything like that. So it was kind of this case where the moment I felt well enough, I started cranking on this review to get it out by the 17th. And, obviously, maybe you've seen on my YouTube channel that sort of parlayed into all this video content. I did a story mode showcase that, took various clips from different early parts of the storyline, showed a bunch of tracks, showed a bunch of characters. That went up on the 17th, and, that was really kind of a delight seeing people genuinely confused about why I had Team Sonic Racing so early. And it's because I work for TSSCnews.com. When you are a professional, and it sounds weird for me to call myself a professional, but when you are a professional, certain opportunities start becoming available to you, and having early review copies is one of those things. TSSC News has been around since, what was it, 1998 or something, 1999. Tristan, I can't remember if it was this year or last year that Tristan did the 20th anniversary. But we've been around for a while, and I've worked personally at TSSC News for going on 11 years at this point, which is kind of a wild thing to think about. So, we're a mainstay of the Sonic community, let's say, and we were offered a review code, and that review code went to me. And that was an interesting experience, let's say. I'll talk more about the game later, because obviously, embargo was up 10 days ago at this point. So, I'm good to go on that point. The weirdest part about all of this was not being able to talk about the fact that I had the game early. That was actually part of the embargo, was that I was not allowed to post, screenshots and videos, or even say I had the game early on social media. And I don't think I'm breaking embargo by saying that. There was nothing because, legalese is the whole act of spelling things out in exhaustive detail to the point where it's actually kind of hard to read. And there was nothing saying that I couldn't say that I was under embargo after the embargo was up. So I should be in the clear to say that I had the game probably by May 9th, May 10th, somewhere around there. And keeping my mouth shut when, if you follow me on Twitter, I live tweet all the games I'm playing. I'm always posting screenshots and videos and whatever else, and to not have that ability was a strange experience. I don't know, but it was also strangely easier than I was expecting. So I don't know, it was weird and cool, and it was nice to finally have the chance to have a review done, not only before the game, or not only by the time the game came out, but before the game came out. Obviously, my video review brand, as it were, has been better late than never video games. And that kind of I've stressed out many times over the years about being late to every party. And, that's a lot of different factors. That's me not having a lot of money. That's me not having Like, I very specifically avoid being part of a zeitgeist, I guess you could say. I don't like being part of a hype cycle. Uh, I've noticed this weird thing about me, and I guess this is kind of just human nature in a sense. I guess they call it like the hive mind mentality or something like that, where, human beings feed on the opinions of others. That's why people giving opinions is so useful. That's also why websites like Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic are so important, because everyone wants to know, like, not the individual consensus, but the general consensus, what everyone is saying, because they want to be a part of that milieu or whatever. So, I very specifically like to avoid doing that, because there have been times in the past where, like, I'm writing a review, and because it's been a review after the fact, after all the reviews have come out, all the professional reviews, rather, I'm sort of writing my review after, maybe after reading someone else's review, and usually I'll, like, leech opinions off of things that I've seen other people say, and I hate doing that, because that has, like, bitten me in the butt in the past. I'm actually, like, really ashamed of my Grand Theft Auto 4 review now, because when I originally reviewed that game, for TSSC News, in fact, that was the very first new game I reviewed for TSSE, I had a glowing review because everyone else's reviews were glowing. And I read their reviews and I thought, yeah, that guy's right. This game is amazing. And you go back and you play Grand Theft Auto 4 now. I played a little bit of Grand Theft Auto 4 right before Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, and I found GTA 4 to be absolutely insufferable. The controls are so sluggish. The cars handle like garbage. I don't like the characters. I don't like the friend system. I don't like the dating system. I don't like the story. I don't like the characters. GTA 4 is a bad game, and it got dated like really, really quickly. And to go back and read that glowing Grand Theft Auto 4 review now is an embarrassment. Like, I never want that to happen again. So usually when it comes time for me to, like, review a game nowadays, we'll say about a week, 2 weeks before it comes out, I kind of just shut down. I block the game on Twitter. I block the game on Tumblr. I don't want to see screenshots. I don't want to see people writing about it. I don't even really want to see trailers. I don't want to see YouTube videos about it, because I want to preserve my personal experience for it. And being able to do that with Team Sonic Racing, having the game so far ahead of everyone else, and everyone else is under embargo, nobody can talk about it, I can't talk about it, no one can talk about it. And to be in that context, like, feels really good, because then you really get, like, the pure opinions. You're not saying, oh, this guy loves it, and I love the reasons he loves it, so I also love it. No, it is just pure reaction, pure opinion, and I love that. That is excellent. But like I said, we'll talk more about Team Sonic Racing later on in this podcast. But that's the reason why I was so late, is, I got sick, and then immediately after I finished getting sick, I had to dive right into doing all this Team Sonic Racing content. I had to finish the review. I did the story mode compilation video, or whatever I ended up calling it, showcase. And then after I did the showcase video, I sat on it for a couple days, and I thought I could do more of these videos. I don't want to just do a story mode showcase. We can also do show people what a solo race looks like when you're not racing as a team. And then, just as a funny joke, I decided, hey, what if we did a 13-minute video where all I did was open Team Sonic Racing's loot boxes? And part of it was a joke. Like, obviously, nobody's going to watch that. But there's always this thought, like, in the back of your head. You look at, like, YouTube metrics for mystery egg videos and the weird things that, like, little kids like to watch. Years and years ago, I remember Pat from the Super Best Friends. He did a stream where all he was doing was opening, I think it was Warframe loot boxes, maybe it was like Overwatch loot boxes. And, that's all he was doing. He was just dumping hundreds of dollars into loot boxes. And people were actually like donating to his stream so that he could open more loot boxes. And I think by the end of that stream, he ended up spending like 300, 400, 500, maybe even like $1,000 on loot boxes. And his girlfriend was like super pissed at him. But obviously, like a lot of that money came from donations during the streams. Like there are people out there that like to watch people open loot boxes. So, it was half a joke, half real, that I just put up a whole 13-minute video of me just opening the Team Sonic Racing quote unquote mod pods, as they were, which is what they call their loot boxes. And obviously, it wasn't super serious. If you watch the entire mod pod video, about, we'll say, like a third of the way through the video, it kind of cuts out for a little bit because I'd actually run out of hard drive space. My Elgato does this like really annoying thing. I tell my Elgato to spit out MP4s, which is a video format. Elgato, like the Elgato capture system, actually records in something called TS, and I don't remember what the TS format stands for, but it is like another video file format, and it records into TS first and then converts to MP4, which is what I want, because that is, what I import into Sony Vegas, or I guess it's just normal Vegas now. But anyway, what happens when it does this conversion process, it doesn't actually delete the original TS file. So if I record, a 20 gigabyte video, that's actually taking up 40 gigabytes of space because I have two identical copies of the same video, one in the TS format and one in the MP4 format. So, I had all this Team Sonic Racing footage on my hard drive that was probably like almost 100 gigabytes or whatever. So, halfway through this Mod Pod video, I'm just sitting here mashing the A button, looking at my TV, and I glance over at the computer, and it says, "You have run out of hard drive space. We have temporarily paused the recording." So, I just left that in. I figured, who cares? It's kind of a joke video anyway. So about a third of the way through the video, it fades out and it says, "Whoops, I ran out of hard drive space." And then it fades back in. And at that point, I've like footage of like 20 mod pods are missing because, that's how long it took me to notice the warning from Windows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, theoretically, if I hadn't run out of hard drive space on that video, it could have been like a good 20 solid minutes of just opening loot boxes. But I guess you were spared for however long that takes. But that's it. That's for Team Sonic Racing. That took a few days, let's say. And then obviously, once that was over, I was kind of right back into the usual situation again, where I was, enough time had passed, because I babysit kind of on like a cycle, right? We're supposed to babysit every single week, but usually so that I can work on my YouTube channel or whatever else, I get the option to babysit only once every 2 weeks. So by the time, I got past being sick from the stomach flu or the food poisoning or whatever it was, finishing up my Team Sonic Racing review, recording all these videos, getting them posted on my YouTube channel, it cycled back around where it was once again time to go back and do more babysitting. So, that added even more time onto that, because once I'm done with something like that, like once I'm done babysitting or working on a video project or whatever, usually it takes like a day of resting and relaxation, maybe a couple days, just, like a short little rest, not really like a whole week-long vacation or whatever. But it takes a while before the creativity starts to feel like it's flowing again. And that sounds like super pretentious to say, I realize that. But that's just the way it is, The day after doing something like that, the next day I just kind of want to sit around and veg out for a little while. And then the day after that, once I've had a day to rest and recover and whatever else, then usually I feel kind of like, okay, what do I want to do? Do I want to make a video? Do I want to work on a video game? What am I doing? So that brings us to a couple days ago where everything else has been going wrong. Just lots of ambient background noise. It's not really been like a super huge like problem or anything like that. But it's been enough of a problem where I didn't want to record in the middle of it. We have some pretty rowdy people around here in this apartment complex on the weekends sometimes, and I wanted to keep that out of potential audio contamination. So there you go. Now it's Memorial Day, and you'll probably be hearing this on like Tuesday, actually. Tuesday the 28th, almost nearly June at this point. But yeah, that's the reason why the podcast was late this time, and it was actually double late, so I get a chance to like complain about it a little bit. So what else has been going on? Obviously, with everything else that's been going on this month, I haven't really had tons of time to work on anything I was talking about last month. That Sonic 3 Complete video isn't out yet. I did a little bit of work on the script the other day when I realized I wasn't going to be able to record. I just, I popped the script open in Google Drive or whatever and, cleaned up some grammar, wrote a little bit more on the ending. It's going to be a long video. I think I talked about this last month. Usually I can gauge how long a video is going to be based on how many pages it takes up in Google Docs. And this one took up currently is sitting at around 7 pages, which off the top of my head probably puts it around 17 minutes, 18 minutes. And, a lot of this is just like a really deep dive on why we haven't gotten a new version of Sonic 3 lately, which, has to do with like the game's musical background, things like that, a potential lawsuit waiting in the wings. You'll find out when the video eventually comes out. Hopefully that'll be out sometime before my birthday on July 6th, actually. I've also just kind of been getting into these funks again, where I don't really feel like doing anything. That's kind of how I was feeling when I wrote these notes. Like maybe that was like the stomach flu or whatever starting to sit in. But I don't know. I've been kind of vegging out a lot on days where I should be doing something. And I think I know like what's happening there. I kind of get into like this nasty bad mood loop where I'm depressed because I'm not doing anything, which makes me feel like not wanting to do anything. And I've learned in the past, like months ago, that if I just break that loop, if I break that cycle, I end up feeling a lot better. But it's really easy to slide right back into that cycle again. So that's actually why the other day I ended up forcing myself to look over that script for that Sonic 3 Complete video I'm doing. But it's also, like I talked about this earlier, my sort of YouTube brand, my video review brand, was Better Late Than Never Video Games. I mean, it still is. I actually, just last month, re-upped for another 2 years on the bltn.net web domain. So, it's still mine. I'm still going to do video reviews or something in that style. I just kind of need to get around to like actually producing something. But there's sort of this feeling like you have to strike while the iron is hot, let's say. Doing everything on YouTube it kind of feels like a race sometimes, where you're kind of trying to get ahead of everybody else, because there's this gold rush on like a new, fresh idea. Obviously, you have like the teens react videos or whatever, where people just record themselves watching live streams and like reacting to it. And usually those are up within hours of whatever the stream was they watched. There's this definite sense where like, if you have an idea for a video, you need to get it up as quickly as possible before someone else beats you to the punch. And, once sufficiently enough time has passed on an idea I have, I kind of get this sense where it's like, who bothers? Or who cares, And I kind of don't want to bother doing it anymore, because it doesn't feel like it's worth it. Like, it feels old hat at that point. Like someone's going to leave a comment on that video and be like, oh, this is so old. Why are you still talking about this? But at the same time, my YouTube brand is Better Late Than Never Video Games, right? So who cares? And that's one of those things that I'm really trying to fight, is that sort of self-depreciating feeling of who cares. You just kind of have to knuckle down and do it, because you never know like what's going to be a success. Part of what made it, a lot easier to move out here to Nevada was that a video I never expected to be popular, sort of like in the weeks before we were set to leave that house in Colorado, suddenly it exploded in popularity. And it was that Sonic Utopia video. And now that video has like almost 2 million views, which is insane to think about, because, it's just raw gameplay footage of a fan game. Those don't usually track super well. And that was kind of like this wake-up call, like anything can be popular. You just kind of have to find your niche and hope that it hits. And then once you hit, you kind of have to follow up on it sometimes. And I've been kind of weird about doing that in the past. I don't feel like, I have this thing about like selling out where I don't want to sell out. And I have friends that are like constantly telling me like, sell out as hard as you can, do brand deals, do all this other stuff. And I don't like doing that. I like doing things that I want to do. I don't like doing things that it feels like I'm obligated to do, if that makes any sense. It's just like, if this is hard like for anyone to follow, just imagine that this is my brain 24/7. It's this nightmare of everything. But I'm just trying to break myself of a lot of bad habits, let's say, because you never know what's going to be successful until you put it out there. And at the very least, sometimes it's worth trying to repeat success, let's say. Strike while the iron is not ice cold. But it doesn't have to be red hot. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. You just got to make the best of it, and you'll never know until you try. That's the lesson. You don't know until you're going to try. Think of it in terms like a video game, right? Like, let's say Spelunky. Spelunky has a daily challenge. And sometimes you get really far in the daily challenge, and sometimes you die early. And there's never really any way to tell how far you're going to get in the daily challenge until you fail. You might have a really bad start that turns into like an incredible run later in the run, where you have like all these super rare items or whatever, and you don't know that until you do that bad start, and then things turn around at some point later in the game. And sometimes you'll get like a super lucky start that then leads to you falling off a cliff and dying to a spike trap or whatever. And you never can tell until you fail that you're going to fail. So you can either like wallow in this misery of, oh, what if I fail? Or you can try, and maybe you'll get lucky and it'll be a huge success, but you won't know until you try. And that's kind of the mantra I'm trying to beat into my own head, because it's easy to say these things, to be like this great mentor that says, oh, there is no do, there is only try, or whatever. I don't know. Sorry, Yoda. But it's another thing to take your own advice, and that is incredibly difficult. It is easy to lecture others, but very difficult to lecture yourself. But yeah, that's trying to shake myself out of a funk. There has been also progress made on a Sonic Forces script. It's not tremendous progress, but again, the Team Sonic Racing review kind of threw everything off. The sickness threw everything off. When you get down with the sickness, that's just how it goes. But I'm narrowing in on something, on opinions. Well, I've already narrowed in on my opinions on Sonic Forces, but I'm starting to coalesce them into a script, let's say, into something, a format that I feel comfortable putting out on the internet. So, know that work is being done on that. Soon that monkey will be off my back and I can stop worrying about it. I did sort of outline another script, but I don't know if it'll ever turn into a video. The title is The Curse of Sonic's Characterization. It's basically about how poorly defined most Sonic characters are, like in terms of like actual characterization and personality and things like that. Obviously, you have characters like Knuckles, who is supposed to be like this great protector of Angel Island, the floating island. Supposed to be sort of like this loner guy who, isn't really like, he's sort of like lived out in the middle of nowhere by himself for his entire life. So he doesn't really have like social skills. He's not really aware of technology. He's just sort of like grumpy and lonely, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, he's supposed to have this like certain kind of personality, this certain kind of like function and role in the story. And the moment that function and role was over, Sonic Team completely changed him into a different kind of character. And, now he's just Sonic's best friend, even though that kind of doesn't really make sense in the context that he was created. And there are a lot of characters like that in the Sonic franchise, where they start out as one thing, they serve their purpose, and then because they're popular, they kind of get brought back, and it sort of like flies in the face of their original purpose. This happened to Shadow the Hedgehog, it happened to Silver the Hedgehog. It's kind of happening to the Deadly Six now from Sonic Lost World, where, it's implied that maybe those characters died at the end of that game, but they still keep turning up in new games, even though Sonic Lost World was a very bad game, and I think the Deadly Six are very bad characters, but for some reason they keep coming back. And, Sonic Team or Sega or whoever tries to find a way to make them fit, even if it completely changes who they are or what purpose they served. And, that's kind of like the idea I was rolling around in my head for this video. It's nothing more than an outline. I've probably said more in this podcast now than I actually wrote down in the Google Docs. So, that's where that is. Maybe that'll turn into a video. Maybe it won't. I'm sort of amassing a lot of these sort of like half-finished scripts and outlines and whatever else that I never do anything with. I think that's probably it for creative endeavors for this month too. We're gonna take a quick break. And when we come back, we're gonna do a new podcast segment, listener questions. So stay tuned for that, I guess. We'll see what's up there. And we're back with a brand new segment, which is user questions. Not long after the last podcast, back in, April? I never really can keep the month straight in my head, but back in April, like a few days after the podcast went up, I got a Tumblr ask, basically saying, hey, why don't you ever take, questions on the podcast? Like user questions from Patreon donors. So I decided, hey, that's actually a pretty good idea. If you remember way back in the day, I mean like way, way back in the day, the original, very first podcast I ever did was called the Patreon Pilot Podcast or something like that. And that was just all questions from my Tumblr blog. And the general idea for that was supposed to be, the whole podcast would be question and answer focus, sort of like my blog is, but that required, all kinds of like weird stars aligning. It would kind of taken focus away from my blog, things like that. It wasn't really in the cards as something I wanted to do at that time. So, what was it? It was probably within a year after doing that one podcast, I eventually launch the podcast as we know it today, which, mainly was birthed out of monthly updates. Here's what I'm doing on my YouTube channel. Here's the games I'm developing. Here is the Patreon content I'm working to provide you guys. And, come to think of it, that kind of shifted focus, didn't it? I could probably stand to go back to digging up and archiving old stuff on my Patreon more, because I really haven't been doing that in a while, and some of that was from the move and the way that jumbled up my whole life for year and a half, 2 years. Gosh, can you believe it's already been that long? I've already lived in this apartment a year and a half. In July, it will have been 2 years since I left Colorado. That is just absolutely wild. Anyway, user questions. That's the name of the game. That's the name of the segment. And we have a question from Gabriel M. He writes, "Hey Blaze, it's Gabriel M. I'm an aspiring game developer, and I think I've learned a lot from both your Let's Narcissism playthroughs and your long-form analysis videos about game design. With that being said, what do you think is the number one thing that all beginner game devs need to know before they get into it? Thanks in advance for the reply. Keep up the great work. Your content's been great in the past couple months." Well, thank you, Gabriel. My answer to that is scope. The number one thing that I think kills all game projects is people getting in over their heads. You kind of have this idea that game development is almost like a form of magic. It just happens. I remember long time ago, back before I even knew how games were made, I'd write letters to game developers. When Sega canceled Sonic Extreme, I famously wrote a 2-page letter begging them to uncancel the game. And, that's kind of embarrassing, but I didn't know how games were developed, so I actually, pitched them some ideas on how to save the game, and, it was all ridiculous stuff. It was, I had no idea how games were made. I was telling them things like, oh, you could use the Saturn RAM cart to store sprites if that was the problem, and it's like, that's not how games are made. That was completely miles and miles away from the problem. Game development is a really weird thing that I think most outsiders do not understand. And I think even if people have an inkling about how game development is done, they still don't really have the perspective of just what it takes to make a video game. And you see that for people that are just getting into game development. They'll say, oh, here's my fan project, here's my fan game. I hate to call someone out like this, but there was a fan game project. I think it was called Sonic Advance Remastered. And the basic premise of that was that they were going to take Sonic Advance on the Game Boy Advance, and they were going to port it over to one of the Game Maker Sonic engines. It was a fairly good one, as I recall. The physics were fairly accurate. It played pretty well. But what they ended up doing is they announced 7,000 bonus features. They were going to have all these extra playable characters. They were going to have all these extra features. Something that a whole team of people wouldn't necessarily go through the trouble of doing. You think about the Taxman and Stealth versions of Sonic 1 and 2 that they put out on mobile, and the bonus features they did for that, and that was a team of 2, maybe even 3 or 4 people between coding, porting, updating the music, designing new levels in some case. That was the team that went on to make Sonic Mania. And it took them months and months and months, this whole team, just to remaster these Genesis games. And I'm sure at this point, in terms of the remastered version of Sonic 2 that Taxman and Stealth did, it was probably pretty easy to just import level maps, coding things, transferring enemy code and boss code and things like that was probably pretty trivial. And, they still had to keep to a fairly tight, fairly small scope for that project. And, here's this 1 or 2 person fan game team just going nuts on bonus features. And anonymously, I actually sent them an ask on their Tumblr, a message basically saying, hey, it sounds like you guys are going to get in over your head and, the project isn't going to get finished because you're putting way too much stuff on your plate. And they responded to me, again, this was anonymously. I didn't want to have my name attached to it and call them out personally, even though that's kind of what I'm doing now, but we'll get to why I'm doing that in a minute. They responded to me after I submitted this Tumblr ask, and they were, the usual response of, oh, don't worry about it. We've got this covered. We know what we're doing. And it's probably been almost a full year since any updates have been posted about that fan game. It may even have been longer than a year since any updates were posted about that fan game. I'm sure if you ask them, they'll tell you, oh, it's not canceled or whatever, but it is very clear that they burned out on the project, or at least some. I don't know how many people were working on this Sonic Advance Remastered project, but somebody high up on that project, or maybe multiple somebodies high up on that project, either burned out on working on it or life got in the way. Always scope your projects appropriately. Remember, how many resources you have to work with. You are just one person, and there's a chance that for, your first game projects, you will always just be one person. You will not have a team to help you design levels, to help you write code, to help you do graphics or music or anything like that. It all relies on you, and you might think that you can just crank it out forever, and, it's no problem that you can just work on this thing forever and ever and ever, and because it all relies on you, it doesn't matter about how many hours you work on it. It doesn't matter about anything. You can, in your mind, you can essentially go forever for free. And that's not how it works. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or in 6 months. You could lose your house to a house fire. You could get a significant other and get married, and suddenly your significant other wants you to move out into the middle of nowhere on a farm where you don't have easy access to internet or even a computer. There are just a million little things that can get in the way to invade your life, to make it so that you can't finish your game if you're starting a game project. So always scope appropriately. Start out as small as humanly possible. If it's your first game project, make the most simplistic idea you can. Go all the way back. Make a 1980s arcade game where, you don't even really have levels. You don't even really have an ending. You just have this looping, super simple gameplay system. And start from there and then work your way up to something more complex. Find your limit. Don't just dive in head first into the deepest end of the pool you can get to, because you're gonna drown. I worked on a fan game project called Sonic the Faded Hour for 9 years, 9.5 years, almost 10 years. And I have almost nothing to show for it because, I spent all this time working on it. I restarted the project 6 or 7 times over the course of developing it, and every time I'd get burnt out or something else would get in the way or whatever else. And, it wasn't an infinite resource. There was not infinite labor, even though I only answered to myself, basically. Something will happen on longer projects. That's also another thing you'll hear from other people, is that basically the more complex a plan is, the more points of failure it has. And this is an old saying with regards to, I think it's military planning. The more moving parts, each individual part can fail, basically. So you want to minimize the moving parts. Make it as simple as you can so that it's completable. Because something's going to fail somewhere, and the more complex it is, the more those failures are going to compound upon themselves and bring the whole project down. So always, always, always know your limits and scope appropriately, because otherwise you're never going to finish anything. Or, even worse, you're going to kill yourself. I know some developers out there who have like insane work ethics, but they are incredibly mentally unhealthy people. And that's also something that you don't want. It'll catch up with you eventually. I mean, just recently, I was watching a talk Griffin McElroy gave at some university. I don't remember if it was like University of Michigan or Philadelphia or something like that. It might have been, his hometown of Huntington, Massachusetts. I don't remember these things. But anyway, he gave a talk at a college about, getting internet famous basically through, the My Brother and Me podcast, through the Adventure Zone podcast, about how he was brought up in like this environment where his whole family kind of had like a theater background and a radio background, and how they were constantly like trying to make each other laugh at the dinner table, and all this stuff about how he came up. And he gets to this point where he's talking about, essentially juggling 7 jobs at once, because he was writing for Polygon, he was doing videos for Polygon, he was doing 2 or 3 or 4 podcasts. He was just compounding and compounding and compounding. And he talks about how like incredibly unhealthy that was, and how he thought of himself, in his words, he said he felt like RoboCop, right? Like nothing could stop him. And eventually he reached a breaking point where everything caught up with him, and he realized, what he was doing to himself, and he had to pull back. And that's when, he quit Polygon, and the pace of a lot of different things for the McElroys like really slowed down, because he didn't have the energy for it anymore. He didn't have the mental processing power to deal with it. And you just have to realize you are not unlimited just because you don't pay yourself. You pay yourself in good vibes, I guess. You pay yourself in relaxation. And you have to realize when you are your own worst boss. So just make sure when you are starting game development that you realize your own limitations. And this goes for anything creative, I guess, technically, because, Griffin, in the context of this talk he was giving, he does podcasts, and he was learning to write music and perform music and all this other stuff. He's writing comic books now. He did a Star Wars thing for Marvel. It's, that man has done a lot. And so, this lesson isn't just for game development. If you're doing like a comic book or writing a book or anything else, just remember to stay healthy, mentally, physically, emotionally. Don't run yourself ragged. Don't kill yourself for a goal that might not be as rewarding as you think it will be. That's my advice. If you would like to hear me almost basically yell into this microphone, with passion, I should add, about something, this is for Patreon donors only. If you are listening to this podcast on YouTube, the next part is going to be bleeped out. But if you would like to submit your own question to this very podcast, have me read it out on the air and maybe give you an intelligent answer, or maybe give you an incredibly dumb answer, oh no, I can't remember the email. Submit a question to, I think it is,
oh yeah,
that is an email address. Again, that is,
oh no.
If I'm wrong reading out that address, you can always go to the Patreon page. As long as you're donating, you'll see, there should be a post buried in there somewhere, depending on how long it's been since I put this podcast out and you're listening to it. But there will be a post in there somewhere called something like podcast email address that will list the email address for the podcast. Again, this is only for Patreon donors, so if you're a freebie, if you're a freeloader, you can always submit a question to my Tumblr, I guess. Maybe I'll get around to that. Maybe I won't. There are questions I ignore on my Tumblr blog sometimes that I don't answer. But if you submit one to this Patreon submission dealio, then I will guarantee to read yours out on the air. Probably. I'm not making a hard promise on that, but I will probably read it out on the air unless it's like weird or too personal or offensive or anything like that. I do reserve the right not to read offensive things out on this podcast. Anyway, again, one more time, if you are a Patreon donor, submit questions to
Excellent!
And I will hopefully next month read more questions out. That'll be a good time, won't it? Anyway, that is the end of this segment. I think we're due for another break here. So let's go to music, and then we'll come back with the usual closeout of video games I've been playing, movies I've been watching, and topics to rant about. And hopefully I'll be less, I feel like I'm getting the hiccups. Anyway, music. I must say, this like, normally, I'm super down on the way these podcasts are, because, I stumble over my words a lot, and I feel like I'm not really being clear about the things I'm saying, but I actually feel, like, really good about the way this podcast has turned out so far. I don't know, maybe you disagree, you probably don't disagree, because people are kind of ambivalent about this podcast, I guess. I don't know. If you needed your dose of me being negative about myself, you just got it. Anyway, onwards to video games I've been playing, music. Gosh. I don't know where music came from. I don't really feel like I could talk at length about the music I listen to like I'm a music reviewer or anything like that. That is something that is completely out of my realm. But what I meant to say was movies. So anyway, top of the list here is very recently, Night Dive Studios put out a brand new port of the monolith first-person shooter, a classic first-person shooter, Blood. Blood's been on Steam for a while now, through an older release, like a re-release called, it's something weird. It's like Blood 1 Unit Whole or something like that. And that is just, as far as I can remember, that's just the DOS version of Blood running through DOSBox, which, it's an old first-person shooter. It kind of plays like an old first-person shooter in that regard. So, you don't get like modern mouse-looking controls, because it's back when they fully expected you to be playing first-person shooters primarily on a keyboard. And, it's not like true 3D, and it's hard to like configure properly because it's just old. That's just how it goes. This new update by Night Dive Studios, Blood Fresh Supply, is basically a whole like redo, brand new port of the original Blood and its expansion, Cryptic Passage. And all it really does is it kind of brings Blood up to speed. That's a phrase I've been using a lot when I talk about this game with other people. But basically, it nudges it, let's say, a little bit closer to a modern first-person shooter. And I don't like using that terminology because I don't want this to sound like, they're changing the gameplay or anything like that. but it just makes it so, like, if you've ever played a Doom source port, let's say, like Z Doom, GZ Doom, things like that, where they take the old Doom and they let you use a mouse to aim, and, they kind of clean up the graphics a tiny little bit, not like remake graphics, but, give you just more graphical options to present things to look cleaner and a little bit nicer and things like that. That's what this fresh supply port of Blood does. And Night Dive's been doing like these old retro first-person shooter updates for a while now. I bought their Turok port a few years ago, or maybe it was gifted to me, I can't remember. But they did a fantastic port of Turok. They also did Turok 2, a really well-regarded port of Forsaken, which was a 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter like Descent. And their latest is this port of Blood. And because, the old port of Blood, one unit whole, was kind of so crummy, I never really got into it. I bounced off of it super hard. With this new port, this shiny, fresh, modernized port of Blood, I finally actually managed to play Blood, with fresh eyes for the first time ever. And it kind of feels like this game that nobody really talks about anymore. I mean, everyone talks about, Duke Nukem, because there was, famously Duke Nukem Forever. There were brand new, reboots of Shadow Warrior, which was another game sort of from this legacy. People obviously are still talking about Doom, but nobody ever really talks about Blood. And Blood is like this really weird thing in this kind of legacy of retro first-person shooters. I mean, it came out in 1998, which, for reference, is after Half-Life. It's after Quake 2. It's after Quake 1. This was a sprite-based first-person shooter in an era where everyone else was using polygons. It was the last game that Monolith made before they transitioned over into making the Lithtech engine, which was their own custom engine that went on to power all their other future games, like Shogo, No One Lives Forever, Fear, all that stuff was Lithtech engine games. And Blood was the build engine. That's the Duke Nukem 3D engine. That's, like I said, Shadow Warrior. That's Blood. And what really sets this apart from other first-person shooters of the era is, so with Doom, you were supposed to be on Mars, technically, right? And you were fighting demons from hell. It wasn't really horror, it was supposed to be a scary game, technically speaking, but it was more like heavy metal, action movie, high-octane action, It was very much that sort of game. Science fiction, you had laser guns in that game, that sort of stuff. With Duke Nukem, you sort of had terrestrial things. You had city streets. You eventually went into space in that game. You fought aliens, real aliens. There were pig cops and mutants, and you went into sewers, and there was a football stadium. There was a level with a McDonald's drive-through. There was an expansion pack where you went on to the White House. It was very contemporary urban settings. Shadow Warrior was Asian influenced. You were this guy with a very racist accent. You had a katana. There was anime babes topless in some levels. You threw ninja stars. I never really played the original Shadow Warrior. Kind of like Blood, there was a port of Shadow Warrior floating around on Steam. I think it was for free. That again had the same kind of weird control problems that, prevented me from really trying Blood out. And I think I do own, there was a more recent port of the classic version of Shadow Warrior that may have fixed things up. And I think I own that, but I've never played it. I never tried it. Anyway, Blood is more 70s and 80s horror movies. It's movies like Evil Dead, The Shining. I reference in my Steam review, I mentioned Phantasm. I don't think Phantasm is really referenced in this movie, but it's very bloody. It's very horror movie focused. There's a map in that game straight up called Crystal Lake, which is the location from the Friday the 13th movies. And you actually find like a corner of a cabin somewhere because, again, it's Crystal Lake. It's like this summer camp location. And you find in a cabin, this decapitated head with a knife hanging on the wall and a hockey mask. That's the kind of game this is. There's another level where you find a glove with claws on the end of it, and you find like this red and green striped shirt, this sweater, and a hat hanging on the wall. It's very much in that sort of The Hills Have Eyes, Evil Dead. I mean, one of the enemies in Blood is straight up a severed hand that kind of skitters around on the ground and goes, "I'll swallow your soul." It's very, very of that era. It is horror movies. And it's actually like, compared to Doom, which again I said was kind of supposed to be a scary game, but was more about the action, it was more science fiction. This is definitely more laser focused on the horror. There are levels in Blood that are actually like a little bit spooky because they turn off the background music and you just have like this cultist chanting in the background, or you have like this giant bony mouth that is crushing up severed heads, or, it's very much like actually sort of unsettling at certain points of this game. There's a little bit, you kind of get that other world or else world or whatever you want to call it from Silent Hill feeling, where it's like, all rusted metal and dark and spooky, that kind of thing, from a sprite-based first-person shooter from 1998. And that kind of plays into the storyline, too. Blood is about, as far as I was able to pick up, because, again, this is 1998. This was before, well, still, even after Half-Life, story really wasn't like a big deal in the first-person shooter. Valve's whole style with Half-Life was kind of putting the storyline into the background and sort of letting the environment tell the story. But that's a digression. There are like cutscenes in Blood. There's full motion video before and I think after every episode that you clear. And as far as I can tell, like the whole thing, the whole story of Blood is that I think you might play as like a guy who worships some sort of evil deity, and then the evil deity, maybe even Satan itself, sort of like says, "Nah, I don't like you guys anymore. You guys are my followers and you're kind of losers. So, go away, leave me alone." And that kind of ticks the player character off. And you go on like this revenge quest to kill this evil god because you are also evil and you want revenge for... Its story is not this game's strongest suit, and I kind of don't really like the idea that you are this evil guy trying to kill more evil things than you are. It's, that kind of thing makes me weird and uncomfortable. I'm not a fan of like anti-heroes, especially if they get a little too edgelordy, and Blood is definitely, in terms of tone, it feels like this is a reference for nobody. But I had a friend in high school who probably really loved Blood because, he was that kind of like, yeah, metal, like not even metal, like I said, Doom was metal. This is like black metal almost in a sense. He was very much that kind of guy, wore black shirts to school all the time, bragged about guns and things like that. Kind of an unsavory character that, underneath sort of had a heart of gold. He was a surprisingly caring dude. Sometimes it was kind of shocking. Like he had this really nasty exterior where he seemed like this really hard edge. He had like buzz cut. It was just, he was a weird guy, but for some reason, Blood makes me think of him because he seems like the kind of, again, references nobody would ever even know, because this is like strictly personal. Anyway, what really I think sets Blood apart the most, though, is like enemies and weapons. Most first-person shooters of the era, even like, Duke Nukem and everything like that, sort of stick to like the Doom weapon set, pistol, shotgun, a laser rifle, rocket launcher, and then like a chain gun or something, right? That's not entirely true of what Blood has. Blood gives you like a pitchfork. It has like 8 different varieties of sticks of dynamite that you kind of, you can cook and you can throw like grenades. There are like sticks of dynamite with proximity detectors on them. There are remote detonating sticks of dynamite. This game loves its dynamite. It has like a napalm launcher, it's sort of like a rocket launcher, but it shoots like this ball of fire. What else is there? There's a Tommy gun. There's a sawed-off shotgun. And then you get into like the really weird stuff. Like there's a voodoo doll in this game that is a weapon that you can use. And it's funny. You point the voodoo doll at an enemy and you see like the guy's hand stabbing the voodoo doll. Your player character, he stabs the voodoo doll and it just hurts the enemy from like no matter how far away they are. There's also like a Tesla cannon. There's probably like the weirdest weapon in this game is like this magical skull staff. And I think it regenerates health when you use it on enemies. And you can also throw it out as like a mobile turret. And that's kind of like the big thing about Blood is I think it is the first game to really invent like alt fires. You think about a shooter and how some shooters let you, so you left click to shoot and then you can right click to get like an alternate fire mode. I'm pretty sure Blood invented that. So like with the sawed off shotgun, left clicking will get you, a single burst. Right clicking will shoot both barrels at once. With the napalm launcher, left clicking will shoot out that one fireball that's kind of like a rocket. Right clicking, alt fire, will shoot out like this bouncing ball that eventually explodes into like all this flaming shrapnel that then covers a huge amount of the area. Oh, there's one more gun I forgot to talk about. It's the game's pistol equivalent, and it is a flare gun. And what really like sets it apart is that it does not immediately kill enemies. It is a flare gun, You shoot at them and the flare kind of sticks in their chest and then it just sits there for a minute. And while it's sitting there, the enemy is moving around. It could be advancing on you. It could be attacking you. And you have to wait a couple seconds for the flare to pop and then it sets them on fire. So, it's just little things like this that really like separate the weapon set from normal first-person shooters of that era. Because, again, we're talking like Quake 2. Quake 2 may as well have all the guns from Doom 2, basically. You have the shotguns. You kind of have the railgun, but that's like the only outlier, right? Blood's weapon set is like huge because, again, they have all these varieties of dynamite. They have the voodoo doll. They have the skull staff. It's just very, very cool. And then you get like enemies. Earlier I mentioned there was the severed hand that can actually like jump up and start choking your character, and you have to like mash the buttons to get the hand off. The most common enemy you face are these zombies. And unlike the zombies in, say, Doom, which are just, guys that you shoot, these are actual zombies. If you shoot one, it'll go down, but eventually it'll get back up. And you kind of have to put them down multiple times. And, obviously, as you go up in difficulty, as you increase the challenge, dealing with zombies and conserving ammo becomes like a really big, important thing to keep track of. You don't want to waste a lot of ammo on shooting zombies, but you still have to put them down so that you can get past and get through the level. It's very like surprisingly unique. And I actually like almost marathoned the whole game I think I ended up buying it right around the same time I got the code for Team Sonic Racing. And, for a while there, I was kind of just bouncing back and forth between the two games. some days I'd play Blood and some days I'd play Team Sonic Racing, or, vice versa, whatever else. And it was actually like probably one of the most entertaining first-person shooters I've played in a really long time. I might not like the story, I might not like the characters, because, I don't like the idea of being an evil person in a video game, especially as like cartoonishly evil as the characters in this game are. The story is thin, but it's really like when it comes in hard and it comes in ridiculous. Maybe look up the cutscenes if you're interested, because they are primo 90s cheese in a way that's like, very simple character models and things like that. The FMV in Blood is ugly, to put it politely. But yeah, like I ended up there. This version of Blood, what is it called? Fresh Supply, comes with 5 episodes, which sort of follows like a Doom format where you have 4 main episodes that comprise, I think, most of the story, and then you get like 1 extra episode at the end, and then a third party came in and made a 6th episode called Cryptic Passage that is also included. So, all told, I think they said there's something like 72 levels in this game. So it's a very, very long game. If you want a lengthy first-person shooter, a retro first-person shooter, Blood's got you covered. There's a lot to do in this game. And, there's a wide variety of weird and horrific enemies, giant shark people and cultists and different kinds of zombies that have different attacks, and just like really like surprisingly creative map design. It's just a really fun, cool, weird, spooky game. I greatly recommend it. I ended up getting it like kind of lucky in a way. I think they're selling it for something like, I don't know, $15 or $20. But since I owned the original port of Blood, 1 unit whole, Steam actually gave me a 50% off coupon, which brought it down to like, I don't know, $7 or $10. And then on top of that, I had like $3 in my Steam account from selling trading cards and things like that. So I ended up only like really paying like $3.19 for this version of Blood, which, I can't complain about that. I definitely got more than my money's worth. It is a remarkably fun game. So, I would even recommend paying for it for full price, because you will definitely get a lot out of it. And I think there's even like a multiplayer mode, deathmatch, things like that. I've never actually, I don't play deathmatch on those kind of games unless like a friend invites me or anything like that. So, I don't know. But Blood Fresh Supply, definitely play it if you haven't. I completed, like, Microsoft sent me this survey many, many years ago, like many, many years ago. I got entered into this Microsoft, like, feedback program, and all that ever really came of it was this thing where, like, I ended up doing, like, a survey one time, and Microsoft actually gave me compensation for that, which was kind of weird. And that compensation ended up being a free PC version of Halo Combat Evolved. And this was all the way back in like 2004. And since then, I haven't heard anything from this program. When I got that cheap deal on Microsoft Game Pass a few months ago, where it was like, $2 for 2 months or whatever, I noticed in my Microsoft account that there was like another survey thing for, signing up for Turn 10 Studios, this survey program for Forza Horizon, because I'd played Forza Horizon 4 through Microsoft Game Pass. So I ended up turning that on and saying, yes, I'm very interested in doing surveys for you guys. And the first one came through not too long ago, actually. I had to watch a Gears of War esports tournament, which was actually like fairly interesting. The production value on that esports tournament was fairly impressive for me. It was, I've watched things now and then, like Evo a little bit here and there. I've watched like AGDQ, obviously. Maybe friends will link me to like a Hearthstone tournament or whatever. So, I have a vague idea of what an esports stream is supposed to look like. And this official Gears of War esports tournament was far and away like way better than that. It was television broadcast quality sort of things. And like the players were actually like, it was a really fun game to watch. But anyway, I had to watch this Gears of War esports tournament and give like my opinions on it. I don't necessarily know why or how that's related to Turn 10 Studios. Maybe they're going to do like esports tournaments for Forza. I don't know. That's not really my place to say. Anyway, doing this survey after the Gears of War esports tournament was over, my compensation for that was a 6-month code to Microsoft Game Pass. So, essentially I have Game Pass all the way through November now. And, actually, it seems like it's getting to be a better time to sign up for Microsoft Game Pass, because they are starting to sign more and more games for the PC end of the Game Pass service. Just recently, like Wargroove got added to the PC Game Pass store and things like that. So I ended up downloading finally. This was something that I wanted to do back when I had that 2 months of Game Pass. I finally downloaded and installed Sea of Thieves. And that was interesting. I mean, I don't know. My main thing, like I was saying, I think earlier, was this? Oh gosh, I'm getting my wires crossed. This was a Tumblr ask that I was thinking about massively multiplayer online games. But if you don't know, I don't really like MMOs, and I guess that's technically what you would consider Sea of Thieves. It's not really what you'd call massively multiplayer, but it is like online, it's team-based, it's persistent. It wasn't really built to be played by yourself, and that's kind of the problem I was running into, is that a lot of the quests and things I was taking felt like they were geared for multiple players, and it was a challenge, but not impossible to pilot a boat by yourself, to captain a boat, I guess you'd say. You just have to get really good at like running around your ship, adjusting the sails, scooping out water and repairing things if things get damaged, learning how to drop anchor or weigh anchor, or, just, you have to learn to kind of multitask a little bit. And the entire reason, like, I'm choosing now to get into Sea of Thieves, I was actually a little bit bummed when my Microsoft Game Pass ran out, a month or two ago, because very recently Microsoft, or I guess Rare technically, sort of soft rebooted the game a little bit, and they added like this whole story mode with all these like actual in-depth quests for a change. Because previously, if you didn't know, like Sea of Thieves was a thin game. It was kind of almost like a make your own fun kind of game. There were like, named enemies you could fight, and there were sort of tasks you could do, but it was all very thin and simple. It was mainly just a world to exist in. And a lot of people, rightfully so, kind of bounced off Sea of Thieves because of this. And now, they've added this story mode. You kind of have these like books that you collect, and each book is sort of like a journal that dictates, or whatever, this series of events, this quest line that you go on. And I think right now, when it launched, there's probably like 5 or 6 of these books. You kind of have to finish one before you move on to the next one. But it is actually like a proper story mode. It's a proper like real quest line for you to follow. And from my experience, I've never played Sea of Thieves until now. It's actually pretty interesting the way it handles all that stuff. You get this journal that sort of tells this story, and from this journal, you kind of have to piece out, what you have to do. And in the case of, the very first quest you get, you have to find this chest. And inside this chest is a special artifact. And you have to match the artifact up with a special location on the map. And it turns into like this series of puzzles. Okay, what does the journal say about where to find the chest with the artifact in it? What does the journal say about where to take the artifact? And, sometimes that turns into a puzzle to solve another puzzle. And it's kind of a cool way to do things because like the whole thing with the other tasks in Sea of Thieves was that it was, pretty loose. It didn't really hold your hand. It just kind of said, here is a general set of ideas. Here's like a single clue. Figure the rest out for yourself. And that's kind of why people bounced off of it, because it was simultaneously very, very simple, but also very, very like situational, I guess you'd say. You really had to know the map to know, maybe you're looking for mountains that line up with a thing you've seen or whatever, or you have to go by, this single line of text in a wanted poster that tells you where this bad guy is. And that, transfers over to the story mode where, you'll have like 7 or 8 pages of flavor dialogue telling you why the chest was lost. And it's actually like a step-by-step, almost like detective thing, telling you, okay, they went to this island, they encountered an enemy ship at that island. You have to sort of retrace their steps to find their treasure chest. And it's like really creative and like doubly creative because all those steps change every time you do the quest. These quests are meant to be repeatable. So they actually, did the quest system in such a way that the locations of everything changes. So, you have this journal describing step by step where this ship went. Let's say you do that same quest again the next day. All the locations of where the ship stopped that you're reading in the journal are all different. You still have to, every time you do the quest, there's always this detective game of figuring out their clues and then following their steps. And it's like a really like cool idea. It's just really complicated to do by yourself. You really need like a crew with you of at least one other person, I've been told. Because it definitely cuts down on the tedium, and doing it by yourself, it is definitely pretty tedious because, if you're doing it by yourself and you die, the quest is over. That means that your entire crew wiped because you are a crew of 1. And when that happens, you start the entire quest over again from the beginning. If you disconnect from the server, you start the entire quest over from the beginning. If the game crashes, you start the entire quest over from the beginning. So let me just tell you that I have done probably the first 5 steps of that very first story quest probably 3 or 4 times. It is a little infuriating. And, I actually had friends that were starting to offer, hey, let's play Sea of Thieves together. Let's actually tackle this story mode together. And I ended up having to quit playing Sea of Thieves for a little while. I don't know if it was the food poisoning setting in or what, but I ended up like starting to get like kind of seasick from the game, which is weird because I don't feel like I'm the kind of person that gets seasick. It's never really been like, I've never really been a motion sick kind of person. It hits me every now and then with certain like hyper specific things. Like this is going to be a massive tangent. But way back in the day, when I was part of the Sonic Roboblast 2 fan game development team, and I knew like the lead coder and lead game designer, SSN Tails, I could actually get him to like program features into the game for me on a whim. And one of the features I wanted him to like try out for me was this thing where the faster Sonic runs, the wider the FOV gets. Or I guess the more narrow is the term, the more narrow the FOV gets. Because if you didn't know, like the more narrow an FOV gets, it sort of like enhances the sense of speed because it feels like you're moving faster. But it also, as a side effect, creates kind of like this fisheye lens effect. And I remember him sending me the executable for that. And combined with like the fisheye effect of this really narrow FOV, with the fact that the FOV kept constantly changing, because you'd go fast and the FOV would narrow down, and then you have to slow down and the FOV would widen back out again. So it was this thing With the FOV constantly zooming in and out, in and out, in and out, this fisheye effect, after about 15 minutes, I was ready to throw up. Like, I was so motion sick. That was the first and probably only time I've ever really genuinely been super, like, motion sick before. It was when trying that out. And I remember just being so miserable for the rest of the night. But like I said, that was like the only time that it's ever really bothered me. Every now and then, if like I'm playing a video game in the car while it's moving, I tend to get a little bit motion sick. But like I played video games on the train ride from Colorado to Nevada, like the entire trip, and I was fine then. Like that didn't bother me. That didn't make me motion sick. So I don't know. I don't really usually get motion sick, let's say. But after playing Sea of Thieves for around, let's say about 2.5, 3 days, just like the rocking of the boat on the water was really just starting to make my head swim in a way that's hard to describe. I was starting to feel like weird and dizzy and just kind of just not right. So I stopped playing the game for a little while, and I've yet to go back to it. But again, I have all the way until November for me to like worry about revisiting Sea of Thieves again. But, that was also, like I said, right around the time that I think this stomach flu or this food poisoning or whatever was setting in. Like I probably was playing Sea of Thieves probably around like May 10th, May 11th, right around the time I got the Team Sonic Racing code for review. And, it just happened to also be that Sea of Thieves was starting to make me feel sick. And then I got Team Sonic Racing to review. So, I shelved Sea of Thieves for now. I've been thinking about it these last few days about trying to go back to it, seeing if the rolling of the ocean bothers me, because Sea of Thieves does this thing, like the water effects in that game are like really spectacular. It looks just amazing. This is a beautiful game, especially like sunrise or sunset, with the way the light gleams off the water, the way they render sea foam and the waves. And it is a very good looking game. Probably the best water simulation I've ever seen in any video game ever. But they realistically model your boat as it sort of sits on the waves and rocks back and forth. And you have, the horizon bobbing up and down. You have the boat rocking back and forth. And it just really got to me. But speaking of Team Sonic Racing, that will be our next topic to discuss. It's an alright game. Obviously, I have a review up on tssenews.com. It will be linked in the show notes. It's an alright game. I'm kind of a little unhappy with the way the review turned out, because it wasn't until like a couple days after the review was posted that I realized, it's kind of a theme, I guess, with my writing. I focused mainly on the negative parts of that game. And that's what I did with Sonic Mania. It is easier to talk about what's wrong with something than it is to talk about what's right with something. And in the case of Team Sonic Racing, there are like there's like a laundry list of just endless little nitpicks that are wrong about this game, but none of them ever really spoil the experience. They're just little things that are, off a little bit. And it's really easy to like focus on those nitpicks. Like loot boxes, or the way the game feels really budget, or like the main thing to me is that the game just doesn't have enough variety, right? You think about a game like Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, and, comparing them side by side, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed and Team Sonic Racing both have the same number of tracks, but it feels like there's less in Team Sonic Racing because of the way they sort of group tracks into these themes. Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed has a lot of like one-off tracks. You have one Golden Axe track, you have one Panzer Dragoon track, you have one Jet Set Radio track, you have one Jet Set Radio Future track, It's all a lot of unique tracks. You have one Billy Hatcher track, compared to Team Sonic Racing, where you have 3 Planet Wisp tracks, you have 3 Rooftop Run tracks, you have 3 Seaside Hill tracks. They're all grouped into these themes that feel really like budget conscious, let's say. They made a collection of assets for this one environment type, and they spin that out into 3 tracks in order to maximize, cost effectiveness for how much money they have to spend on art direction for a track. And especially, like, almost half of this game is tracks reused from past games. Seaside Hill most of them come from Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing. It has Final Fortress, all 3 of those tracks from Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, all of the casino tracks from Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing. And it's not like Mario Kart. Mario Kart 8, half that game is actually retro tracks. But Mario Kart 8, they like significantly redesign those tracks. And even then, they're not really doubling up on track themes. You might get a few Rainbow Road tracks, but in general, you're getting stuff like Cheese Mountain from Mario Kart, Super Circuit, Luigi Circuit from whatever, Big Blue from F-Zero even. It's all still very like unique track themes. And that's not the case with Team Sonic Racing. It doesn't feel like enough. And like I said, it has loot boxes. The roster of racers is really tiny. I don't like the kart customization system. Again, you can go read my review, but it feels like it deserves better. Like we deserve better, like the game deserves better. It is just, it is a noticeable step back from Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed, which isn't actually the name, but, just bear with me. We'll just call it Transformed from here on out. It feels like a step back, both in terms of budget allocated, content available, general polish. It is a step back. There's no buts about it, anything like that. That's just the way it is. And in like researching all of this and poking at things, looking at articles, looking at information on these games, something that I really like, something that like genuinely surprised me about all of this, that very first Sumo Digital kart racer, Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, the first one, is actually in the top 50 best-selling games of all time. This is technically supposed to be like a big tentpole franchise for Sega, or it should be at any rate. And just to think about how much that game sold, apparently, to put it in the top 50 best-selling games of all time, of all time, every video game ever made, Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing is like number 44 in the top 50. Not like super outrageous or anything, but compared to the tens of thousands of games that have been made since the inception of the industry, it is still significant. And even with Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, that game felt like it had budget problems. Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing felt like it had budget problems. Like, that very first kart racer was like a mess, The PC port is a disaster. Like, half the time, half computer systems that run that PC port of Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, like, the game straight up doesn't work right. It has like a shader caching bug that they never bothered to fix. Still, even after all this time, the PC port of that game doesn't have online multiplayer at all. It never got any of the DLC. It is just a terrible, terrible port of the game on the PC. And yet, overall, that game across all platforms is one of the top 50 best-selling games of all time. It made all this money. It probably, made Sega quite a pretty penny, and they just sort of let it languish in this weird state. And the same thing goes for Sonic Racing Transformed. It's not in the top 50 best-selling games of all time, but you'd think with the first game being in the top 50, selling super, super well as it did, that the second game would, get more budget and whatever else. And it has that weird thing where the PC version got all this exclusive DLC that the console versions never got. The 3DS version of that game is also like a disaster. I don't think it ever got all of the DLC. Like even in the context of the PC version getting a bunch of exclusive DLC, the 3DS version never even got the console DLC. Like it never got Ryo Hazuki or the Outrun track, as far as I remember. And the 3DS version has all these other problems. It just feels super weird. Like Sega is really mistreating this franchise, or that Sumo Digital isn't giving it all the attention it deserves, or just something's being mismatched here. And, that's kind of the story of the Sonic franchise in general, but it's really weird to think about and look at, and it's just, I don't know. Team Sonic Racing is a very solid 6.5 or 7 out of 10. I ended up giving it actually 3 out of 5, which by my metric, because I use like the full 5-point scale in my reviews, by my metric, a 3 out of 5 is slightly better than above average, let's say. So, it's an okay game. Definitely, I don't think it's worth $40 if I'm being honest. But if you pick it up for like 15, you'll get enough enjoyment out of it. I love the soundtrack in that game. I think soundtracks in the past Sonic Racing games were maybe a little lackluster. I wasn't really that impressed with the soundtrack in Transformed. It was kind of just like, original tracks that were slightly remastered by Richard Jacques, or Richard Jacques, however you say that man's last name. And they were okay, but they were a little flat in my opinion. I didn't really like the soundtrack to Transformed. And then, the very first Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, you just had like unlockable music from the games that, these characters were hailing from. So it was just, their original tracks. But it was nice having like unlockable music, because you could set up custom songs to play while you raced. You'd unlock a set of like Jet Set Radio Future tracks, and then when you loaded into the Jet Set Radio Future course itself, you'd get like a little option to select the music that you'd race to. And that was nice, and that hasn't really made a comeback since that game. But speaking about Team Sonic Racing, I really do think like the soundtrack in this game is fantastic. Sega or Sumo Digital, whoever, kind of went out of their way to like collaborate with a bunch of like sort of well-known, people within the Sega family, I guess you'd say. Like T. Lopes does a track with Jun Senoue, things like that. Tomoya Otani's back, and he's collaborating with someone else. I don't know if it's also T. Lopes. It might be. But it just, in general, it all just sounds really, really good. There are some bangers on this soundtrack, to be sure. But not Crush 40. Crush 40 turns in a brand new vocal track called Green Light Ride, and I am not really a fan of it. I think Crush 40 is past their prime. I think I had a Tumblr ask go up about this recently. It's fine if they're past their prime. Everyone has only so much in them that they can give. And creativity is like this resource that's difficult to recharge. So, Crush 40 gave us some really good songs. Open Your Heart, Live and Learn. Those are excellent songs. Primo fine music, very much appreciated that they gave us that music, but I don't think they've been good in a while. And they're visibly, I think, getting worse as they keep forcing new music to come out. It is definitely not the era of Crush 40 anymore. And I hate to say that, because I do think, a lot of people are excited to see Crush 40 come back. And I'm kind of excited to see them coming back too. I just wish the song was better. And it's not. Green Light Ride is probably the worst song on that soundtrack. And that's just how it is. You can't really help it. That's just how it goes. Final thing on this list, I saw Avengers Endgame, and by which I mean I kind of had to see Avengers Endgame, because the directors or the writers of that movie, the Russo brothers, kind of gave the world an ultimatum. They said, hey, if you don't see Avengers Endgame in the first 2 weeks, we're declaring it open season on spoilers on social media. And let me just tell you, as a person who rants about spoilers quite a bit, that is like a super not cool thing to do. That is probably like the most not cool thing you could do. It feels like they're holding me ransom in a way, or like something weird like that. It's another marketing tool is what it is, right? They're saying, hey, if you're worried about Avengers Endgame spoilers, you better give us money now, because some idiot on the internet is going to spoil it for you, and we're actually going to encourage them to do that. And I would ask anyone listening to this podcast not to support that kind of action. And like, it actually happened to me a little bit. I was browsing social media and I ended up seeing, well, like on the day that this spoiler thing was lifted, I ended up seeing like a lot of spoilers on Twitter, including someone actually tweeting out an image from the climax of the movie. Because, the Russo brothers said it was okay for me to do this, and really you're just doing this to yourself, right? And oh my gosh, I am angry about that. And like, the person that ended up doing it was actually Matt McMuscles, formerly of Super Best Friends Play. And when I realized that's what he had done, that he had actually tweeted out spoilers from the climax of the movie, of one of the most important movies, well, not important, but one of the biggest events maybe in my lifetime yet. Like, yeah, that even that sounds weird. I don't know how to really phrase this without it sounding weird, but Avengers Endgame is a big deal, let's say. It is, kind of a culmination of nearly a decade's worth of movies, sort of building up to this one super important turning point, I guess. Anyway, because he tweeted out spoilers, an image literally from basically the end of the movie, I unfollowed him from Twitter. Like, that sounds like such a really like tiny petty thing, but it's just, you don't do that, my man. You don't. I don't care who says it's okay. You don't do that. And this guy, Matt McMuscles, he has problems with spoilers regardless. But just, the movie, I really liked the movie. It has a lot of fun moments in it. But again, I kind of felt like I was forced to go see it, because otherwise, I'd see that Spider-Man Far From Home trailer, where, the first 10 seconds of that trailer openly spoil things from the end of Avengers Endgame. It's just, you can't do this. If this is what movies are going to be like, Endgame was fun, Endgame was an event, but I'm not going to play ball with this sort of tactic forever. I don't see more movies than I do see. If you're going to be holding spoilers ransom like this, or whatever we're going to call this, I'm just tapping out of your movie entirely. The whole experience, like I said, even though I enjoyed the movie, it left a really bad taste in my mouth, a really bad aftertaste, let's say, that someone okayed this. Obviously you can hear, like, I'm visibly upset now that I can barely even sort of be coherent with what I'm trying to complain about. It is a bad scene. It is a bad way to conduct business. Do not like. Anyway, that's it for the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this. I've actually enjoyed producing it for a change. That's kind of like a weird backhanded thing for me to say. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this podcast if I didn't enjoy it in general. I mean, I've been doing this podcast for 3 years now? Gosh, that is a lot of podcast. Anyway, Thank you all for listening. Again, if you are a Patreon donor, make sure to submit questions to...
I'm number one!
And if you're a freeloader and somehow you find out what that email address is, do note that I will be screening to make sure that future questions actually come from Patreon donors. Anyway, I will see you all next month, and I hope none of you out there spoiled Avengers Endgame for anyone. Okay, bye!